In America and Europe, popular sympathy for a Jewish state had been growing, and when David Ben-Gurion proclaimed the State of Israel on May 14, 1948, he knew that he had the backing of many governments, including the Soviet Union. But Israel's claim to sovereignty was immediately challenged by the surrounding Arab states, Egypt, Lebanon, Syria, Iraq, and Saudi Arabia, and within 24 hours the ongoing border skirmishes became a full-scale war. The battle was hard-fought in some areas, such as Lod, but the Arab armies were no match for the Israelis. The Jewish militia, the Haganah, quickly defeated the various Arab forces that stood in their way as thousands of terrified Palestinians fled their villages or were forcibly removed by the advancing Israelis.
It's at this time then that you really get what we could call a civil war, and between Palestinians and the Zionists, who had much better organization, not quite as much manpower then, but by the spring they were much better off. And one of the myths of this whole period is that you had a little Israel, small Zionists against the Palestinians, and then later on in the war, when the Arab states invaded, that it was David versus Goliath. They were facing overwhelming odds, and this was simply not true, because even then Israel, from May of 48 on, had more troops than the Arab states, who had very small armies. See what I mean? So, but that's one of those things that many people believe. One of the other arguments that has come down, which has now been refuted by Benny Morris in the second edition of his book on the birth of the Palestinian refugee problem, was that the Arab states called for the Palestinians to flee in the spring of 48. There's no evidence of that. What really did happen was many, and this is unfortunate for the Palestinians, they had no central leadership. And you had some bands from outside of irregulars who were doing most of the fighting, but there was no organization and tremendous divisiveness because these groups were controlled by Egypt or Abdullah of Transjordan, etc. You had no unified leadership. And the Zionists had a nucleus of very good fighters and a much better command structure and leadership. And finally, in March, they began a push to ensure their control of areas that would become Israel under the partition. And as that happened, you began to get many more Palestinian Arabs fleeing, particularly after a massacre at a place called Deir Yassin, although people now think it was probably somewhat over 100, but not 200. But Begin and the Irgun and the Stern gang, Yitzhak Shamir was part of that. There was a combined attack in this Palestinian village that massacred many people. And the Palestinians did carry out a retaliatory raid, killing about 70 Jewish doctors on the road to Jerusalem shortly thereafter. But after that, you had mobile radio bands that Begin put into play, threatening more Deir Yassins if the Arabs didn't flee. In other words, you'll be massacred just like Deir Yassin. So it became part of the propaganda. And ultimately, as there's a lot of film of this, people just fled. And in one case, the mayor of Haifa, a Jewish mayor, asked people to stay, but in most cases, nobody didn't. And as Benny Morris now shows out, people were strongly encouraged to leave. There were atrocities on both sides, but people were raped, people were shot, period. And about half the people fled or were forced to leave before Israeli independence. And then when you had the Arab wars, the Arab invasion and the Arab state wars in June and July of 1948, you had the deliberate expulsion of 300 more thousand. Rabin was involved in this, and Lida and Ramla. And this is where you get a major influx of people going to what we call the West Bank. And you therefore have the armistice that's set up in 1949 that sets up lines, but an armistice means the state of war still exists. You see what I mean? So technically nothing has been settled. So you have two conflicting narratives, shall we say, as to how to interpret this. And these narratives and the conflicts in them come down to the present day, because most people, including people in the West and in Europe and the United States, if you study Middle East history, you study Middle East history. And that's true, although with variations in the Arab world or elsewhere. In Israel, however, the curricula has the history of the Jews being entirely separate from any history of Europe or the Middle East or anything else. So if you study Middle East history, it's not that, it's the Arab world and Africa. You say, Israel's not in it. So, and this is not necessarily true for Israeli scholars, but it is true for many people that their whole history in Israel of Zionism is distinct from anything that happened in the Middle East, you say. But for the average person, it's very easy if you have a system like this to fall into the trap of looking at this totally in terms of reacting to injustice. And this became all the more understandable because of the Holocaust, which nothing was deserved. So why did this happen, you say? So this also creates a mindset that if the Arabs are doing this, how could they do this to us? Look what happened to us here, etc. That's understandable. It's also understandable for Arabs to look at Israel, however small it was, as a much more powerful country than they were, which they did from the beginning. They feared Israel, regardless of how people over here looked at this in terms of geography and territory, etc. And they had a right to fear it. Israelis were Europeans. Technologically, they were way ahead. They brought technology with them. They were superior in all of this militarily to Arabs. And this came out in the 48 war, and I might explain some things that occurred at this time, how the division occurred, because when you had the Arab state invasion, Egypt, Syria, you had Iraqi troops, you had some Saudi, the Lebanese did very little, and you had the Transjordanians. This will become Jordan, which includes the West Bank after 1948. Well, when they invaded, there was no coordination because no one trusted Abdullah of Transjordan because he had been dealing with the Zionists in sort of what we might call a non-aggression pact. Although many Israeli historians deny this vociferously, there clearly were discussions and agreements. And although maps show that when you have this attack, you have what we call a Transjordanian attack against Israel, in fact, there was really no attack per se. They were holding on to positions in the West Bank, but where you did have conflict was over Jerusalem. But the Israelis were able, the Zionists, well, they were Israelis after May 14th. When they were confronting the Egyptians, for example, or other people, they really didn't have to worry about their backs in terms of where the Jordanians were, because the Jordanians weren't going to attack them. You see what I mean? So if you'd actually had a coordinated attack, it might have been quite different. But what Abdullah wanted to do, essentially, was to get that land, or a lot of it, that he'd been promised in the 1937 Peel Commission report. Remember, he's going to get part of Palestine, and they're going to be part of Transjordan. They're not going to have their own state. And there had been a tacit alliance between the Zionists and the Transjordanian leadership all along to deny the Palestinians a state. They divided up among themselves. And this was always the case. As a matter of fact, Jordanian history until the 1990s was pretty much that way, to deny Palestinians any opportunity of recognition as a people with a right to a state. So in the fighting that occurs then, the Israelis are able to hold back the Egyptians and ultimately to be successful. And you do have this fierce battle for Jerusalem, which will then be divided, with Western Jerusalem, the more European quarter, becoming Israel, and then divided, and then the old city, which is only about a quarter of a mile in area, would be Jordanian. Now, so you'll have this situation with, and which is going to last until the 1967 war. And from Israel's point of view, it has become secure, but on the other hand, there is great insecurity, because many of the Palestinians who have been dispossessed are in the West Bank, and the West Bank could be from here to the house next door in terms of where you are, and you're looking at people who are now farming your land, Jews, etc. First of all, the major tensions for a lot of this period in the early 50s were on the Jordanian Israeli border. And while you did have some attacks aiming to try and kill Israelis, the vast majority were pilfering, stealing, etc. And they were by Palestinians coming in, or sometimes they're trying to sneak in to come back into Israel and try to blend in with Israeli Arabs. On one occasion, one of my favorite stories, some sheep were stolen, a ram and a few ewes, from Israel into the West Bank. And Moshe Dayan and Ben Gurion's acolytes, other acolytes, wanted to have a military attack, retaliation, but Moshe Sharet, who was then the prime minister, refused. He said, why are we going to kill people for sheep? And ultimately, with UN intervention, the sheep were returned. They said that the ram was a little bit the worse for wear. Obviously, he'd been breeding some Palestinian sheep over on the West Bank, but it was done without any retaliation. But the basic attitude of Ben-Gurion, Dayan, Shimon Peres, very hard line at that time, was to retaliate and to prove how strong you were. And Dayan has admitted openly now that sometimes when they claimed they were reacting to, like, Palestinian assaults or intervention, quite often they were doing training missions where they would provoke the action in order to then get training in fighting the Jordanian army. So the Jordanians didn't institute this, the Israelis did. You had a crisis in Israeli political life in the early 50s, 53, 54, because Moshe Sharett, who had been prime minister, was much more cautious about using military retaliation and was more interested in negotiation or exchanges. And the Ben-Gurionists thought he was a coward. And what happened here, which has a lot to do with the Suez Crisis, is that in 1954, Gamal Abdel Nasser had come to power in July of 52. He gained real control of Egypt in the spring of 54, and he finally gained the final victory for Egypt. He got the British to agree to withdraw from the Suez Canal zone, which was a 200 square mile area. It's not like some little strip. And this would happen by June of 56. Well, the British had many troops there, obviously, and you'd had a lot of fights and chaos and strife there, particularly in 50, 51, 52. So you have a situation where the British, this is a tremendous triumph for Nasser. And Israelis who are in the government, Sharett now is prime minister. Ben-Gurion has gone into semi-retirement. Not necessarily totally committed to it, but and he's still in touch with all his people who are in the Sharett government. And people in the administration, the Israeli government, decide that they will activate a spy ring in Egypt to put off bombs to make people think that the Egyptians are incapable of protecting foreigners. That way the British will stay and keep their troops in the Suez Canal zone. See what I mean? Now, this is a cockeyed idea. What's even worse about it is that it was done without Sharett's knowledge. It was done behind the back of the prime minister by people who are these hard right-wing guys. And they were caught, the people in Egypt. And they were thrown into jail, there were trials, 2 were hung, etc., etc. But the Israeli public all thought all along that this was a lie. The Egyptians were lying, there was no ring. Why? Because Sharett, once he discovered, couldn't admit that he didn't know about it, that this was done behind his back. So you create this image of this persecutor Nasser operating with no justification. See, when in fact, you'd had the spy ring all along, and Sharett couldn't admit that he hadn't known about it. This did not come out until 1960. So this begins tensions, and the Israelis are very upset, and the public is very upset. There seems to be a threat from Egypt here. Ben-Gurion comes in back in February of 55 as Minister of Defense. He tells Sharett to stay out of the way. You have a major retaliation against Egyptians in the Gaza Strip. 40 or 50 are killed, and this is going to set off an arms race that will ultimately be a major factor in the Suez Crisis. Part of this, see, is not just Arab-Israeli stuff. It's, in this case, Israeli domestic politics and people going behind the back of their prime minister and not admitting it. So he has to go along so he doesn't make the Israelis think that they're leaderless, you know what I mean? Now, in 67, we're going to see this in the opposite way, because it looks like the Egyptian military operated behind Nasser's back to do certain things that created the crisis in the 67 war. Now, Nasser then looks for weapons from the United States, but there are too many strings attached. So he goes to the Soviet Union, this in 55, and he gets, through Czechoslovakia, a major arms deal that is going to set off an arms race. In the meantime, he has fully blockaded the Suez Canal. He had allowed, to Israeli shipping, he had allowed ships with other flags going to Israel to go through, and he fully blockades the entrance to the Gulf of Aqaba, up to Aqaba and Eilat, which is the Israeli port, into the Red Sea. No Israeli ships can go through there. So this is a stranglehold, although economically not as serious as it was presented, but to the sovereignty of Israel, clearly it's a major affront. So the Israelis are furious, but this is in reaction to all these things that have been going on in 54 and 55. So the Israelis, who already have been getting arms from the French, have another arms deal with the French. And you're building up tensions where Dayan and Ben-Gurion, they can't get the cabinet to agree, want to invade Egypt and take over this area, Sharm el-Sheikh, which is now a resort area. You had a horrible terrorist bombing there over a year ago, which controls the entrance to the Straits of Tiran and the Gulf of Aqaba. So other factors come in. We were going, and the British were going to fund an Aswan Dam in Egypt, the building of it. Nasser plays footsie with the Russians to see if they can get a better deal. The British are getting very angry at Nasser because he's, to use the slang, he's an uppity Egyptian. He's a wog. You know, he's not acting with proper respect to the British, and he seems to be interfering in Jordanian politics, which infuriate the British. There are a number of issues causing the Americans and the British to become angry at Nasser. And for John Foster Dulles at the time, one of the major things was that he then recognizes Communist China in May of '56. Because we always fought in the UN at the time, your young listeners here will not know what I'm talking about, to keep Communist China out of the UN. It was a major victory. Now, Israel recognized Communist China in 1950. See, that didn't matter. When Egypt did it, it was a big deal. So we, in a humiliating way, rejected the Aswan Dam deal in July of '56 and told Nasser's ambassador to go to the Russians. This was in Washington. Nasser, 2 weeks later, on an Egyptian holiday, announces the nationalization of the Suez Canal. You know what I mean? Which technically was going to go over to Egypt in 1968. This is 1956. This causes an immense crisis in which the United States objects to military intervention, which the British and French want. They want to have simply the UN get involved and negotiate. Nasser promises compensation to the company shareholders, the Suez Canal Company, etc. Behind the scenes, the Israelis and the French are using this as a pretext to prepare an attack on Nasser, saying he's a danger to civilization. Nasser now becomes the Hitler, just as Saddam did in 1990. And you have to take him out because he's a threat to world peace. The French are involved with the Israelis. They've been arming the Israelis all along. They're very close. They were those who were encouraging the Israeli nuclear developments at the time. But also the French, you see, were holding on to Algeria. They had just lost in Vietnam in '54. They were going to have to withdraw. They were ultimately going to give up Tunisia and Morocco, which flank Algeria, after not too much nationalist protest. This is an era of decolonization after World War II. But Algeria, they went in 1830, they colonized, they drove the Algerians off the land. They had made this what we call in French, a département of France. It's like a province, it's like a state, like Kansas in the United States. And so it was part of France. You're going to hold on to that. You've got 1 million people, French, Italians over there, etc. Well, you're not going to leave. And you have a civil war that begins in a war against them in 1955, which was commemorated in this film, The Battle of Algiers, which is a classic film. Now, the French were convinced that Nasser, he was supporting them in a propaganda way, but they thought he's sending weapons over there. So if we can get Nasser out, the Algerian revolt will collapse, and we can keep Algeria forever. This was nonsense. But they're siding with the Israelis, and finally they get the British in as of September, and they create a collusion for the Israelis to attack first, and then the British and the French go in, pretending they're separating the combatants, but they're really trying to overthrow Nasser. And this is how the Suez Crisis developed. And even though the Egyptians were taken totally by surprise and were beaten, as like Nasser withdrew his troops from the Sinai when the British and French began to attack, nonetheless, Nasser emerged from this a hero because, in a propaganda way, he stood up to imperialism. See what I mean? And Israel was shown to be, in the Arab view, more emphatically an arm of imperialism. Britain and France, the former colonial masters, etc., etc. Israel gained a great deal out of it because it was able to get the UN to agree that the Sinai would be neutralized and Sharm el-Sheikh, there would not be any blockade. And the Israelis also were able to insist, this was very significant in the UN in March of '57, that if Egypt ever again blockaded Sharm el-Sheikh and stopped shipping, this would be what we call a casus belli, mainly in international law, a legitimate cause for war. And Nasser will do this in May of '67. Now, what's the United States, the British and the French were humiliated. And the Algerian revolt is going to go on. Anthony Eden, who was Prime Minister, had lied to the House of Commons. His career is over. He has to resign. British imperial power is essentially shattered, certainly in the Mediterranean, and its legacy. But the United States then jumps in. Even though we had opposed this, we then act not with respect to our former position criticizing the attack. We act with respect to Cold War ideas, because the British and the French had allies, in Syria, Lebanon, and Iraq, even though they were out of there. Jordan, they've been humiliated. We have to step in. We create an Eisenhower Doctrine in January '57 against anyone supporting communism, seems to intervene in affairs. And you have various attempted coups in Syria, which have been written about by a CIA agent called Wilbur Eveland, Ropes of Sand. He says this is, on one of them he says, this is one of the most unprofessional CIA operations I ever saw. He writes about driving from Beirut up to Damascus with a suitcase full of money to give the guys to try and overthrow the Syrian government. We did a lot of this at that time. We'd been involved in overthrowing Mossadegh in Iran in 1953 and putting the Shah in after he'd had to flee. The same Shah who gets ousted in 1979 in the Islamic Revolution. This was our attitude. We were doing it in Central America, Guatemala, elsewhere. And we did it in the 80s under Reagan. You get rid of people you don't like and they're socialists. Doesn't matter if the people support them. We want our own people in here. It's an anti-communist thing. What matters to stabilize after this, even though for a couple of years Egypt and the United States have very difficult relations, they seem to improve. But on the Arab-Israeli side, in terms of war, you have very little conflict until 1963-64, when, because of Israeli water operations, you have major clashes with the Syrians. And it's out of this that we begin to get developments leading up to the '67 war, because the Palestinians had begun to organize groups in Kuwait. And they then spread the Fatah, for example, Arafat's group, is founded in 1959 in Kuwait. There are other Arab groups, and they all go to Beirut. Beirut's a pretty freewheeling area. You can publish anything you want. Money's available, etc. And now Fatah under Arafat was a group that wanted to regain Israel. It didn't care about Arab politics. But a lot of these other Arab groups were Arab nationalist groups. The Pan-Arabism was immense at the time. Nasser and the Syrian and Iraqi rulers were at odds over this in terms of who was really the main Arab leader. And a lot of these Palestinian groups were also Pan-Arab groups, which meant that they wanted to have revolutions in the Arab world before you overthrew Israel. See what I mean? So you gain your socialist, Arab nationalist objectives. Arafat and those people could care less about that. You get major tensions developing out of this, and a Arab League conference is called in January '64 because the Syrians have been accusing Nasser, this great Arab leader, of being soft on Israel. You see, Syria and Egypt had united in the United Arab Republic back in '58. The Syrians broke off from it in '61. They resented Egyptian rule. And once they did that, they began under the Ba'ath Party, which is a socialist party, not a Nazi party as the propaganda line goes today. They began to attack Nasser, saying, we, the Syrians, are the true leaders of Arab nationalism. You're a fake. You're a phony. Furthermore, you're afraid of Israel. What are you doing about them, O Gamal? So you're hiding behind these UN groups out in the Sinai. You're saying a lot, but what are you doing? And in order to respond to this, particularly in terms of the Syrian-Israeli exchanges over the water developments in '63, this Arab League conference that Nasser calls creates the PLO, the Palestine Liberation Organization, which is not intended to do anything except being sort of a rubber stamp for Nasser. Although it does get a little bit out of hand in terms of recruiting. King Hussein throws it out of Jordan, for example. But Fatah and Arafat and these guys are not members of the PLO at that time. They don't really join until '69, after the '67 war. And the Syrians, seeing that the PLO is controlled by Nasser, start to use Arafat and Fatah for raids into Israel. And this leads, with a great deal going on, to major tensions exploding between Israel and Syria, but also with Jordan, because the Syrians send in these groups through Jordan, through the West Bank. And the Israelis, doing their Iron Wall approach, attack the Jordanians, leading Hussein to think they want to overthrow him. He can't figure out what's going on here. Because the Syrians and Jordanians hate each other, and the Syrians want to overthrow King Hussein, and yet when the Syrians do this, the Israelis attack the Jordanians. And Israeli domestic politics come in this, because Levi Eshkol is a very moderate prime minister, and the military thinks he's weak, sort of like Sharet was back in the mid-50s. So in order to show he's tough on the Arabs, he's got to respond to this with major raids, one in Samua, S-A-M-U-A, in the fall of '66. That leads Hussein to think in '67 he's got to align with Nasser, whether he wants to or not, because of what the Israelis seem to intend. So you get all these different factors in domestic politics on all sides coming into this. Well, this really heats up because Nasser protests that he is strong against Israel and the Palestinians, but you really get the major threat in the spring of '67 when things heat up with between Israel and Syria. And the Egyptians are told, and I'll go into a little detail here, the Egyptians are told that the Israelis have threatened, and they have weapons, and they've got an army on the Syrian frontier. They're going to attack. There was no mobilization. Although Rabin and some other people had threatened on Independence Day celebrations in May of '67 to attack the Syrians if they continued this. But nothing had been mobilized. In any case, Nasser either believed this or chose to believe it, which I think, in order to make a show of force, to go into the Sinai in order to show how tough he was against the Israelis. You know what I mean? And he goes in, and here's where people now think that his generals undermined him. Because we're not sure what might have happened if the UN had said, we're not going to remove our troops, we're going to keep them here. We're going to refer this to the UN. But the generals who went in said, you removed them immediately. And then the UN Secretary General, Utant at the time, a Burmese, said, yeah, if he wants to remove it. The Americans were furious at this, because you could have stalled, you see. Something might have happened.